I'd like to thank Futurismo Canarias for the kind invitation and the excellent hospitality. I'm very pleased and honored to be here with you today and sharing the stage with some very honorable and respectable figures that have helped shape the future of this destination. My destination will be about developing solutions for tourism growth management, or to put it simply and use a more popular term that has been massively used in the last few years. We'll be talking about over-tourism and what destinations should do to deal with it. So throughout the course of the presentation, we'll be discussing about all latest market developments, research snapshots, and regulatory updates. And I'll also share with you a practical toolkit that we have co-developed with European Cities Marketing, which is the association of all tourism boards in Europe, for helping destinations to deal with it. Okay. So these things are not happening only in Greece, where I'm coming from. So for decades, tourism has been portrayed as a positive contributor, as an angel of positive change, generating tourism jobs, contributing massively on the local and national GDP, and also becoming an angel of cultural exchange. And while this is still the case, we see that the rapid increase of visitor numbers and latest reaction from many residents in many established destinations are bringing now a changing mood about tourism. And we see sustainable tourism ideas that until very recently have been adapted only from a small segment of the travel sector, now becoming mainstream, not only in terms of media exposure, but also in terms of residents' perceptions. So besides being a positive factor, tourism congestion is now closely associated with things like increased congestion, infrastructure under pressure, tourism affecting the identity and the authenticity of places, environmental degradation, and damage to historical sites and monuments, among other things. All major travel organizations, in order to deal with this increasing pressure, like European Travel Commission, UNWTO, and WTTC, are launching new strategies, directions, and guidelines to help destinations to deal with this phenomenon. But let's be honest here. Tourism has indeed a numbers issue. There are already approximately 50 countries where tourists outnumber the local population. And while you would expect countries like Andorra, Monaco, or Malta to be in this list, you see large countries like Spain and France also being included here. But it's not a new thing. Over-tourism is just a new hype term for a problem that is very old. In fact, the academics and tourism scholars have identified the correlation between tourism growth and the effects in local destinations since 1970s and 1980s. But over-tourism is part of a much bigger problem and is closely associated to the population growth, especially in the urban centers. You see, every single day, 180,000 people are moving to cities. Since 2007, for the very first time in human history, the majority of people is living in cities. By 2025, 600 cities will be responsible for creating 65% of the global GDP. By 2030, the size of middle class, which is actually responsible for this massive increase of travel activity, is expected to reach 5.3 billion people, while 2/3 of the global population will be living in cities by 2050. A recent study from McKinsey says that already the established destinations and the big city capitals of the world are in unbearable congestion levels already, with major effects in the local and national GDP already taking place. But it's not just a city's problem. Over-tourism can occur in pretty much every kind of type of destination: rural, coastal, city, and even historic sites. And those who are most vulnerable and fragile are those who have a high risk of climate change impacts, which are the island states, for example. Those who have a high economic dependence on tourism, like most of the Caribbean and Mediterranean destinations. Those with a fast-growing middle class, like in Southern and Southeast Asia. And those where the local government has a very low ability to manage tourism growth in terms of human capital and budget. Do you already recognize your destination in some, if not all of these areas? I'm sure you do. But this would be something that you would probably expect. You see, the Canarian Islands or the Balearics have an intensive tourism activity for approximately 60 years. So having some negative effects is something that you would rationally expect to happen. To understand the effect of over-tourism, especially in the last 10 years, it's probably more indicative if we take a look on a new destination that just arrived. And we have here the case study of Montenegro. Montenegro 20 years ago was just going out of a civil war with military conflict still taking place around the region. 10 years ago, it was a virgin destination with very limited visitors activity. In the last 5 years, global media has portrayed that as one of the new destinations off the beaten path, the upcoming new places that all tourists have to travel. Visitors start flowing in, cruise companies start introducing Montenegro within their programs. Eventually, in less than 10 years, UNESCO informed Montenegro that if they continue like that, they would probably lose their UNESCO's historic site license. That's very indicative of how rapid increase taking place in tourism in the last 10 years is going on. UNESCO is further emphasizing on this problem by claiming that only 1/3 of UNESCO's natural and cultural sites are actually having an up-to-date, robust tourism plan in place. And even those who have are in constant pressure to introduce new types of regulations and measurements to deal with increasing visitor flows. Of course, it's not just the population growth and the uprising of the middle class. It has to do a lot with the low-cost travel and the evolution of low-cost carriers, the increase of cruise companies' programs, and of course, that makes affordable traveling for pretty much everyone. And of course, lately, the Airbnb and the short-term rentals effect. Airbnb, while in principle and in the very first stages of its development, was claiming that they're bringing income to those places that are less benefited from tourism, and they spread tourism activity in non-congested areas. Very rapidly, they became part of the equation and part of the problem. Airbnb not only declined all zoning regulations as we know it that far, but also in all latest studies and researches, it's evident that the vast majority of short-term rentals activity is taking place exactly where tourism congestion is experienced. And in addition to that, we have this Mark Disneyization of tourism and the social media effect. You see, all of us claim that we want to live as locals, we want to experience a destination as a local, and we want to seek for these unique spots that no one else has ever seen. But the truth is that besides a small segment of travelers who think like that, the vast majority of us want a McDonaldized form of authenticity. We want a standard type of comfort, evident everywhere we travel. And we're not really seeking for those unique moments. With the social media effect, we want these moments that everyone else has already done, and we want to tick the box and claim that we've done that as well. So to address all these issues, we have worked together with European Cities Marketing to develop a practical toolkit, a small snapshot of which I'm going to share with you today, just the key principles and a few good examples across the world. You see, to address tourism congestion, overcrowding, or over-tourism, you can choose any kind of term that suits you better. It's very important, first of all, to address it within your destination strategy. Not just your destination strategy, really, but also within your economic development plans. Making it part of your destination strategy will inevitably bring specific measures that are going to deal with it. And all major and established destinations across the world are already including that. London and New York City are already applying specific measures for overcrowding. Barcelona is following in order to deal with residents' backlash and increased pressure from the citizens' community. Well, the Copenhagen went one step further, and they declared the end of tourism as we know it by launching a new strategy where the localhood and the residents' role would be the key element in the tourism sector, advocating all the good benefits that tourism brings, but also suggesting new measures on how it could be more sustainable. For a strategy to be efficiently applied, we need to have proper public-private strategies in place, not only within the tourism sector, but in every single segment of the local economic activity. A nice example comes from Lisbon, where the local authorities made an open call and created a specialized program welcoming the startup ecosystem to provide solutions for affordable housing and sustainable tourism development measurements. It's also important to keep working closely with our traditional partners from the travel trade sector, trying to extend the tourism activity on the shoulder season and those months, the off-peak months. It's also important to review tourism planning and zoning regulations. The cities, probably the human's most important invention, is a living organism, which is keep growing and changing all the time. And this is something that, with all this growth, we keep to forget. Most of the most established destinations are still based on zoning and town planning regulations of previous decades, while the needs and the challenges that we are facing today are very much different. Tourism gentrification, if it takes place properly and proactively, like New York did in the last 15 years, can result in positive benefits. New York, with a very specialized urban regeneration strategy, managed to have the positive effects of gentrification in areas like Bronx, Harlem, and now Queens, which were traditionally degraded and had problems, while on the very same destination we see that lack of proactive movement on the Manhattan on the Manhattan district is bringing negative effects of the gentrification itself. After we have a proper destination strategy in place, it's important to review all our on-the-ground visitor management policies, introducing new policies like extending opening hours at seasons, have guided tours in non-congested areas, and integrated visitor flow systems that take in consideration where there are queues and where there is increased congestion in real time. Innovating our public spaces to afford both residential and tourist activities is also important. Santorini, a Greek island which faces similar challenges with many Spanish ones, went very aggressive the last 3 years by introducing a tourist cap on cruise ship visitors up to 8,000 a day, which is half than it used to be. And I must admit that if you know the size of the island, it's still a big number. While the local authorities have worked extensively with a big number of local hoteliers, persuading them to stay open for the winter months as well in order to extend the season. limiting transportation options like road closures or specialized public transit only to those congested areas, and smart technologies are also part of the mix a strategy like that should have. Raising prices, not only as a reactive part of the demand and supply that organically happens, but as a solid strategy well in advance. The global champion in dealing with increasing visitor flows, Disneyland is doing that for years, and yet remain to see actual benefits from it. Embrace smart technologies. We now have those technologies available that could actually help us to interact in live terms with tourism audience and inform them which places of our destinations are already congested and redirect them in other places. Amsterdam is successfully doing that with Guggenheim, which provides you this kind of information for both residents and tourists. As we discussed before, it's also important to manage the so-called sharing economy and the increased short-term rentals activity. Pretty much all major destinations across the world in the last 5 years have launched revised regulatory frameworks. Some of them are very harsh, some of them are quite lenient ones, trying to force the platforms like Airbnb, first of all, to help them register all the properties, and then to have certain thresholds in terms of the number of days that the property is rented or the type of the property, whether it is primary or secondary one. We're working very closely with HOTREC, the European Trade Union of Hotels and Restaurants, to have strong lobby in European Commission and further enforce this kind of regulations. However, to be honest, we admit that although now we have regulatory frameworks, there is only a small number of destinations where actual results have been experienced so far. Talking about thresholds, this is where a destination where its carrying capacity has been already exceeded need to consider taxes, caps, and limitations. And I know that there is a discussion in Gran Canaria Islands as well about placing a tourism tax in the future, and a debate on whether this is going to happen or not. But in those destinations where the problem is probably bigger than, here, tourist caps taxes have already been applied. Venice has already included a tourist cap of up to 10 euros for going into the historic center, and also enforced much stricter policies for the cruise companies. Balearic Islands have recently become the first destination in the world to enforce United Nations Sustainable Agenda 2030. Also, they have increased the tourism tax, and they made a commitment that in the next few years they will reduce the number of birds from 600,000, which is now, by 120,000 less. And other destinations across the world, like Cinque Terre, who are experiencing similar problems, are following the same course of thought. Of course, for those strategies and management practices to be successfully applied, citizens' engagement, public consultation, dialogue, and efficient marketing communications are very important. We need bottom-up strategies involving residents in every single stage in order for them to decide what type of tourism and how much tourism they want into their destinations. And there are a lot of destinations who are actually adopting this kind of logic. We also need to review the way we market to different audiences. It's not about marketing to visitors anymore, or just to visitors. It's about marketing to residents, educating them, but also to the business community. It's indicative to say that Amsterdam, the tourism board for the Amsterdam region, 3 years ago declared that they will not spend a single more euro for marketing to visitors anymore, because they have all the visitors they want, and all this marketing budget will be reallocated for educating the visitors on how they should behave while they are on the destination, but also educating the residents that we are now living in an integrated visitor economy, and that they also need to adapt their way of living. Educating the residents for a more sustainable way of living, like other big cities like London and Paris are already doing. Or educating the visitor that if a proper visitor behavior is not taking place, certain rules or even penalties might apply, like Amsterdam did in the course of the Enjoy Respect campaign. Or other, more creative ways to address that, like Florence Cathedral's smart activation, asking for people to, instead of draw to the wall, to have a digital graffiti next to the church. Of course, it's important for every strategy to have a proper measurement and monitoring system. And the problem here is that in many cases, we are looking at wrong metrics and broken data. An indicative example is the Travel and Tourism Competitive Report by the World Economic Forum. I'm sure you all know about it. It's a very credible data source that every single economist or government in the world takes into account when they build their policy plans. In this data that we all respect, you see some discrepancies that doesn't make sense. For example, Hong Kong ranks higher than Finland in terms of natural resources. Luxembourg is considered more appealing than India. Moldova ranks higher than the United States in terms of health and hygiene. And Malta is considered a more inviting place than Canada, just because World Economic Forum is measuring the road density in order to come up with this conclusion. Reviewing the data and the correlations we do before taking actions and decisions is a very important thing. And it's the time that counting volume of visitors is not anymore acceptable as a measure of tourism success. We need to see all the other alternative types of indicators, not just quantitative, but also qualitative ones, like which is the local population's increase and decrease in specific zones in correlation with the tourism activity that is taking place there, which are the property prices per square meter in these very same areas, which are the number of bed nights per inhabitant, and whether this is sustainable and within the current capacity levels of the destination or not, which is the local resident sentiment, how people feel about the tourism activity in different districts, not in general about the city, which is the number of daily visitors at key attractions and the share of bed nights. Destinations around the world are now going into more deep dive research approaches trying to identify those elements. A new study supported by UNWTO explored 500 destinations. Iceland, Vienna in Austria, Costa Rica, and many other destinations are now completely changing the way they're collecting data by focusing more on how happy the residents are with tourism activity and not just about growth, visitor volume, and the average expenditure. To wrap this up, although it's very important for the private sector to have a very strong contribution to that, when we're talking about macro strategies and policy making, it is the government that needs to take the lead. It's the governments that need to review the zoning regulations and create all these synergies, while DMOs and tourism boards need to continue to be strong ambassadors and advocates of the positive effects of tourism. Before taking action, we need to ask the right questions for our destinations. Which is the authority and the decision-making power of the local governments? Which are the qualitative metrics that we want to measure? Not just the growth, but how tourism impact affects the local society, culture, and environment. And we should always remember that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. What worked for Gran Canarias might not work for another destination. Every place is unique with different planning needs and a very different social mix that we need to consider. We should always bear in mind that everything we discussed today in terms of the over-tourism phenomenon is something that most of travelers, and definitely the travel sector, are not really familiar with or they don't really care about. What people care about is those very practical things that we all understand and want to happen. It has to do with the quality of life, the air we breathe, the future of our children, and all these policies that makes these things to happen in a sustainable manner. So thank you very much for your time and your attention. I was speaking quite fast to stay within my slot. And gracias, one more Spanish word that I know. Thank you.